Welcome to our second section on charts in Excel 2013. In the previous section we created this chart showing the lengths of some African rivers, and we've got it on a separate chart sheet in a workbook, and we're going to start this section by doing a little bit of formatting work on the chart. There are quite a few things wrong with it. For instance, the title isn't right, but I'm really going to concentrate on the design elements first of all. Now, as I pointed out towards the end of the previous section, when you have a chart selected, you have chart tools, and the chart tools consists of these two tabs, design tab and a format tab, and at the moment we're going to go for the design tab. Now, I resized this chart, made it a little bit bigger before. If you find something's difficult to work on, you can either change its size or of course you can change its zoom. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to reduce that. It's currently 81, 70%. That's fine. I can now see the whole of the chart. You may find the names on the bottom here, the names of the rivers, difficult to read, but that's one of the things we'll come back to a little bit later on. So there's my chart. With the chart selected, I'm going to select the design tab, and we're going to look at some of the options here on the design tab. Given the type of chart, and this is a 3D column chart, right in the middle there is a section called chart styles, and this is basically a gallery of the available ways that a 3D column can look. Now watch live preview as I hover over them. If I click the bottom right hand corner here, the one that's got a more screen tip, I'll get a list of all the available types. So as I hover over them, I can decide which one I like the look of. I think I quite like that one actually. That's style 12. And then in addition to choosing the style, I have a button over here to change colors. Chart, quick colors, customize color and style. And with this one I basically have two groups. I have a colorful group. Each row represents the sort of color palette for the particular chart that I'm working on. Colorful, for instance, the top one there gives me a mix of colors for different aspects that I might use in my chart. The monochromatic section, the longer section down there, means that if you choose one of these, you basically get one color. So if I wanted to stick with a primarily sort of blue range, which is the top range there, again it's got live preview, maybe I'll go down and try that one. So we're still with this chart and we're still on the design tab. Let's now go to the first button over here on the left, add chart element. And that gives us access to defining, modifying, removing various elements of a chart. We have the axes titles, chart title, data labels, a data table, grid lines to the chart, and legend. I'm going to go through each of these. I'm not going to dwell on them for a long time because it would indeed take a long time to go through all of them. Great area for you to experiment with. Let's start with chart title. Now at the moment the chart title we've got was something that Excel 2013 picked up, and it currently, you can tell which one I've got at the moment because you can see the button that's highlighted in the flyout menu there is above chart. Now let's go into the bottom option there, more title options. We have a box around the current title, and one thing you can do is click inside there and we could actually type what we really want the title to be. Okay, I think that's a much better title. And still working on that title, let's do a little bit of formatting on it itself. Let's look at fill first of all. At the moment the fill setting is automatic. Supposing I go for a solid fill. Now at the moment it'll use one of the colors from the palette that I chose. Go into the color picker down here, and it's got that one. Let's go for a lighter one, say that. I can also change the transparency if I want to. Okay, that'll do for fill. And then for the line, the border around the title, it currently has automatic. What about saying no line around it? Let's see how that looks. That's fine. So when I finish working with this particular panel, click on close, and I've now got a much better title than I had before. Okay, back to the next chart element. Let's look at the axis titles. Now at the moment we don't have any axis titles. We can set a primary horizontal or a primary vertical. Notice as I hover over each of them, primary horizontal for example, an axis title appears, but it just says axis title. Now you could argue that in a chart that's called Lengths of African Rivers, the fact that it says at the bottom Okavango, Orange and so on pretty much gives you a clue that that is the axis with the rivers on it. I suppose some purists would say it should say river in the axis title, but I don't think I'm going to put an axis title on there. However, on the primary vertical axis, I think there's a good case for having a title because you haven't actually explained what the units are. So we're going to go for primary vertical, and one thing to notice about that is that that involves putting text on its side, which is absolutely no problem in Excel 2013. All you need to do is to click within the box. You see the cursor, it's sort of lying on its side, and you have to have this rather strange experience of using the up arrow to move along the text if you're using the keyboard keys. But I can delete the title that's there, and I can put length, open brackets, kilometers, and I can click somewhere else within the chart, and I've got my axis title in place. Now I hope that you can see from this some of the ways that you can improve the look and feel of a chart. I should point out before we go any farther, I'm doing this on the separate chart sheet, but all of these facilities are available if I'd left the chart on the original sheet, so hovering over the rivers data. I would have been able to do just the same things there. What I'm going to do now is go back into Add Chart Element again. There's still a couple of things to look at. I want to look next at Data Table. And this is a very interesting option, particularly if you put this on a separate sheet, because you can, for instance, say, at the moment it says none. Supposing I said data table no legend keys, what you get, I'll just choose that option, I'll undo it in a moment. If you look down at the bottom, you've actually got the table with the data in it. So it gives you each of those lengths in the form of a table under the chart. Now, as we'll see later on, with some charts where you've got a lot more data and you haven't just got one river, one length, you've maybe got several values associated with a category. Having the data table there can be really useful. In this particular case, it doesn't help very much because you've only got the length of each river. So what I'm going to do is go back here, go back to data table and select none again. Now what I want to do next is to look in a little more detail at some of these formatting options. We've added a title, we've added a label on the vertical axis. Let's look at what are called data labels. Now at the moment each of these columns in the chart, we can see which river it corresponds to. There's the name at the bottom, Nile there for instance, and then the river itself we can read across to see what the actual length in kilometers is. I removed the data table that we only had there temporarily, of course. You can actually put a label on each of these blocks with the number, with the length in it. And that's a good option to look at in terms of what these panels are and the information in these panels. So let's go back into that again, and let's go to data labels and go down to more data label options, and that takes me through to format data labels. Now with format data labels there are basically four categories of things that I can do, and that's quite typical when we're trying to format some of these chart elements. There's the first category, which is fill and border. The second category allows me to put effects on these, shadow, glow, soft edges, 3D format. The third category, size and properties, and the fourth category is details of the labels themselves. Now if I look at the label options, at the moment I have value selected and I have what's called show leader lines selected. Now if I take one of these, you can actually move this away from its bar if I want to, and if I do that That's what a leader line is. It's one of those little lines. And if you're trying to do something really clever with one of your charts and you need to move a label like that, that's the sort of option you have. I could, for instance, include in that category name. Watch what happens if I check this checkbox. I get the category name Niger, 4184. So you can see the level of flexibility you get when you're formatting even something like data labels in Excel 2013. Now you've got all these other options. I'm not going to go into them now. You can change the size. You can set these effects like shadow and glow. You can set the fill. You can say whether the labels have got lines around them or not. So I could go for solid fill on the label. I could choose a nice light color, etc. So there are many things you can do with every one of these potential elements that you can add to a chart. So there are still a few elements on Add Chart Element that we haven't covered. Things like legend, for example, and grid lines. One or two of those are pretty straightforward. Primary, major, horizontal grid lines. If I also put on primary, major, vertical grid lines, you'd get grid lines in both directions, of course. I don't think the vertical grid lines help very much in this case, so primary, major, verticals can come off again. And things like axes themselves, we have both axes at the moment. You wouldn't necessarily always need both axes. But if you look to the right of Add Chart Element, there's another button there, Quick Layout. And Quick Layout is actually quite handy, particularly when you're first using a chart or when you just want to do something fairly quickly. You have to look at those thumbnails fairly carefully. But what each of those thumbnails is a representation of a certain combination of these chart elements. So if I take, for instance, that one in the middle there, that one says it's got a title but it hasn't got a legend. A legend is the little box on the right. So if I go back to the first one again, that's got a legend. Now the legend on the right here doesn't help much. You can see there it just says length kilometers. I've got a title, I've got a legend, I've got grid lines. If you look at the one in the middle at the top, I've got a title, I've got a legend under the title. Note that's what the little thumbnail there means. I've got no grid lines at all on that one, and I've got a horizontal axis but I've got no vertical axis. Now if you hover over each of those thumbnails, it has a different combination of those key chart elements, and sometimes just by clicking on one of those you can quickly get the combination of elements that you want. Now I hope you get the idea here. There's obviously many combinations of these on the Design tab, and the other point to bear in mind is that with each of the other types of chart you can use the Design tab, but the options that are available will be different. The sort of thing you get with a pie chart is very different from that which you get with a column chart, and in fact in the next section we're going to look at some of those other chart types and the features of them. While we're in the Design tab, just one other thing to point out, there's a straightforward option here to change the chart type. So if you wanted at this point to say, no, I'm not going to use a column chart after all, I'm going to use something else, you could go into the dialog there and change that type while you're still in the Design tab. And there's just one other thing I'd like to point out. Now, if you haven't actually got the Design tab selected, let's say you're on the Home tab or something like that and you're looking at a chart, you can still do many of those things. For instance, these three buttons that I mentioned earlier, that one is the Chart Elements button, so that basically does what the Add Chart Elements button does. That one will do chart styles for you, so if I click on that I get access to the styles. And this one, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on, is the Chart Filters button, whereby you can decide which data points are visible on your chart. The other thing is, if you right click on the chart, you get a contextual menu that includes a number of these options, and in this top section, this sort of special mini toolbar up here, you can quickly format chart elements. For instance, back wall is selected there. Back wall, I could go into fill for the back wall and say, oh, I'm actually going to fill the back wall with that color. And then maybe you could go to the side wall, same sort of thing, and say, I'm going to fill the side wall with that color, and so on. So a lot of the formatting can be done away from the Design tab anyway. So in the next section we're going to look at some of the other chart types and some other formatting options, so please join me for that.